Okay, so this week marks 70 years of the People's Republic of China, specifically from the 1st of October. The National Week holiday is always a big event in China, but this year it's particularly on a big scale because it's 70 years, a round figure. As I recall, it was big on the 60th anniversary as well. It's a public holiday, but this year there is an added dimension because of the crisis in Hong Kong, which of course the mainland has tried its best to, well, do one of two things actually. One is state media initially tried to ignore what was happening in Hong Kong, and now they are portraying it as terrorists and rioters basically. Just a quick point about that. It is true that in recent weeks there has been acts of vandalism and rioting. It's very hard to say that there hasn't. Unfortunately though, this is a small number of people, and what CGTN and Xinhua are doing is saying that this sort of vandalism represents all the demonstrators. Let's not forget 2 million people. 2 million people showed up earlier this year in the largest demonstration in recent years in Hong Kong, in opposition to China's agenda. Now that's a lot more than the estimated 100,000 that were in Beijing to mark the 70 years of the People's Republic of China. So Hong Kong is a real testing ground. I suspect behind the scenes Xi Jinping is furious about the situation. I suspect behind the scenes he is rattled. But of course the party will never, they want to give the image of a strong leader. Xi is the most authoritarian leader since Chairman Mao. But this is a good opportunity to reflect on the last 70 years. And I don't intend this to be a very in-depth video, but I've been studying China now for well over 10 years, and there are a lot of talking points to make. Firstly, what's obvious is that the celebrations are in overdrive. Ideological communism, that is Marxist-Leninist, dividing the means among the masses, that sort of communism doesn't really work in today's China. Of course you will see it in the textbooks, of course you will hear about it, but the reality is most Chinese are like people everywhere. They just want a comfortable life. They're materialistic, very materialistic in fact. Young Chinese want the latest smartphone, etc. So they're like young people everywhere. So the Communist Party is that they know that they can't rely on old-fashioned communism, ideological communism. So what do they do instead? Instead, the new religion of the Chinese Communist Party is ultranationalism. And this is very, very obvious by events over the last 10 years. If we consider the maritime expansionism in the Pacific and the South China Sea, which China laughably claims is legitimate, I mean, they're literally building artificial islands and saying it's Chinese territory. And what they consider Chinese territory goes basically right up to, I think it's something like 10 or 20 miles of the Philippine coastline. So smaller Asian neighbours are right to be concerned about China's approach in this regard. China likes to talk about its peaceful rise, but this is clearly military expansionism. And in the parade in Beijing there was a big hideous statue of Mao Zedong. There was also military the military might was well on display across the country. Pretty much every school is trying to outdo one another to see whose students can be most patriotic. You just go on Chinese social media, especially a week ago, the red flags are absolutely everywhere, and there were a lot of references to Hong Kong is China. Never mind the fact that China's broken the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but since when do they care about that? So you can't escape that nationalism. It's absolutely everywhere, more so than usual. It's always there, but it's absolutely an overdrive. It's really, really palpable. And some might say, oh well, what's wrong with that? It's just their national day. Americans do the same on the 4th of July. French do it on Bastille Day. I would argue there is a political dimension that you wouldn't necessarily get with, for example, Americans on the 4th of July. In Britain, we don't even have a single national day. But most national days are just that, national days to mark the beginnings of a nation. With the Asian rising powers, I guess this is also true of India. You know, nationalism is also very palpable right now in India, and it's any attacks against Modi and the BJP are perceived to be anti-Indian or anti-nationalistic. Einstein was right. Nationalism is the measles of mankind. And I do think it's important to differentiate between patriotism, love for one's country, and blind nationalism that is to hell with everyone else. This is not to say that if you're a foreigner in China, you're going to be treated unfairly or badly. I mean, I personally felt that I was treated in a very hospitable way. People were kind, people were generous. So this video shouldn't be perceived as xenophobic. But you know, unfortunately, even though the 70-year-old rule of the communist regime doesn't define China as a whole, it has now become so interlinked with it that if you criticise the CCP, you're immediately deemed as being anti-China. A student of mine actually sent me a video and she wanted to know why the guy was being anti-China. The irony is, he was actually being a Westerner who was being an apologist for China. This was connected to Hong Kong. But obviously that got lost in translation, and the paranoia was such that, oh, Westerners speaking about China, it must be negative. And we just see the sensitivity of China these days. You know, the slightest misunderstanding can result in an international incident. There was a head of a big organisation recently, I can't remember precisely, I forget which one. It wasn't a bank, it was another big multinational. But the CEO had spoken about, he was talking about the situation of pigs in China, by which he meant swine, like agricultural livestock, pigs. But he naively said Chinese pigs, and that was perceived to be a racist insult, even though that wasn't what he meant. And even though he apologised, and even though this was amended, there was, whoa, the Westerners insulted the Chinese. So there is a bit of knee-jerk hysteria, frankly, sometimes, that is very obvious from an outside perspective, and you don't get in every other country. You get it in some countries. I'm not going to say sensitivity is just a domain of the Chinese, but offending the feelings of the Chinese people is very much a go-to for the Communist Party. So that's the situation today. We're dealing with a rising superpower that's very sensitive. But let's look at the last 70 years. Okay, people could say I'm biased, I'm just demonising the Communist Party. So what have they done good? They probably have improved things for women's rights compared to old feudal China. So women's rights probably have overall improved. The communists and in the Kuomintang before them did get rid of foot binding. That was a good thing. I give them credit for that. They have genuinely lifted millions out of poverty. Again, that cannot be criticised in of itself. The Chinese middle class is massive and very influential. So I'm not going to dispute they have done that. They have had major achievements in space, in science, in lots of other areas. The 2008 Olympics, political as it was, and as much as that overseas nationalism was plain to see, it was a very impressive event. It was an incredible event. I think the most watched sporting event in history. Something like 3 or 4 billion people watched it, which actually makes it the most watched event in history of any kind. That was very, very impressive. But what was also on display there was, like I say, that exported overseas nationalism, where the so-called Mainlanders, these guys in blue outfits, actually had the arrogance to push past police officers in this country. One of the torch carriers, Connie Huck, who's a presenter on British television, spoke of her shock at the way they were barking orders at her. There was a real bullying attitude to those Minders in blue. And I think that when we come up to the 2022 Winter Games, which is being hosted by Beijing, we absolutely should refuse any sort of torture relay through this country because of what happened last time. I think it would be an absolute travesty if China is allowed to have that again in the same way. I mean, they're having the event, but I don't think, given their arrogant attempts to override local jurisdictions, I don't think we should be... Our official approach should be, we wish the games well, congratulations to China for hosting the games, but we're not having a repeat of that. As far as I'm concerned, that was a national humiliation. We need to look at our friends in Australia and what the Chinese are trying there with their underhand tactics, and we need to make it very clear that we're not going to tolerate them using international students as pawns. But anyway, focusing on the 70 years. So, 1949, the country had come out of a brutal civil war, one of the bloodiest civil wars in history. Range of dead is anything from 4 to 6 million people. I think it is second only to the Russian Civil War, actually, as the deadliest modern civil war. Although the Taiping Rebellion in the 19th century was incredibly costly, something like 20 to 25 million dead. So it was a poor country, it was a devastated country, and the China of 1949 very much was, I don't tend to use the term, but for want of a better term, a third world country. Fast forward 70 years, it is a rising superpower, largest military in the world, very powerful country. So it's come a long way since then. When assessing Chairman Mao in particular as the founder of the PRC, and it is curious that it's his face, not Sun Yat-sen, that is on the notes. That's notable because it was Sun Yat-sen, Sun Yat-sen, I would say it in anglicised, but I know that's not the correct pronunciation. But anyway, he was the founder of Republican China, yet it's Mao that is on the notes as founding the PRC. Anyway, his record was absolutely abhorrent. Under Mao, China witnessed the worst famine in human history. A famine so deadly that it killed more people than the entirety of World War I. At least 36 million people. There is extensive archival evidence of this, extensive research by people like Yang Zhisheng and Frank Decoter. And this wasn't just a famine, which would have been horrible in its own right. What I hadn't realised until quite recently was this was a famine that was Sun Zhongshan, I think that's the correct pronunciation. Apologies there, I should have remembered that. But anyway, this was a famine that was matched with extreme violence that easily rivaled anything in the Cultural Revolution later. Because when we think of the Maoist chaos, we tend to think of the Cultural Revolution. I hadn't realised that actually the violence of that era was profound. I mean, it was like Pol Pot's killing fields in Cambodia times 10, times 20. Horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. Easily one of the darkest periods of the 20th century anywhere. Then the Cultural Revolution, absolute chaos. Mao turned the young against the old. He basically wanted to destroy China in order to rebuild China. The logic of a megalomaniac. I watched Inferno the other day, the Robert Langdon based film, and he came out with a line at the end, because the subplot, if you're not familiar with the film, is a group of renegade people who want to control overpopulation by killing billions, and as Langdon's character said, that's the logic of tyrants. You kill millions to save millions. It's just it's a megalomaniac logic. Mao Zedong, in my opinion, knew what he was doing. The Gang of Four were very much scapegoated for his excesses, but it's interesting because on one hand they were scapegoated and they say, oh well, Mao had bad advice. On the other hand, he was venerated, he was idolised. His little red book sold more than any other except for the Bible and Quran. So on one hand he was treated like a man god, on the other, oh well, he made a few mistakes. And what I find frankly hard to stomach about the Communist Party of China is their sheer dishonesty, particularly when it comes to Mao's record, but also since Mao's death. I mean, Mao killed more people in peacetime than any leader in the 20th century. That includes Stalin. And yes, it includes Hitler. I mean, if you, depending of course on the criteria of Hitler's democide, the Jewish Holocaust and everyone else that was persecuted, if you count all World War II deaths in Europe as being Hitler's fault, then that significantly rises his toll. But in terms of domestic policies, Mao is by far the worst. And yet this is a man who is still venerated in China today. People will say he made mistakes, talk about trivializing evil, talk about downplaying the excesses. Since Mao died in 1976, we've seen the excesses of the Communist Party. Tiananmen Square, which they still won't come clean about 30 years later. And I always say, if they were simply acting to control riots, why don't they just say that? Why do they censor it? It's simple. If you're hiding something, you cover it up. The brutal persecution of Falun Gong, the persecution of human rights activists in China, and today the treatment of the weaker people. This is a party that I think is unsurpassed in human history for persecuting the people it's supposed to represent. I don't think any other regime in history comes close to the sheer scale of control and persecution that the Chinese Communist Party is guilty of. And the cowardly way in which they censor facts from the Chinese people, it's repugnant. So in China, all you will hear about is their achievements. They will never ever admit their crimes. They will never ever admit their excesses, or if they do, it's always with the caveat, oh well, he made a few mistakes, and we've learned since then. The irony, of course, is Mao was targeting his own party. It was kind of like cannibalism. He was turning the party in on itself. So when I look at these extravagant celebrations, I cannot help but feel a little bit sick about it, because there is obviously real jubilation going on, but this is covering up 70 years of famine, persecution and lies. I don't know what's going to happen in the next century. Clearly China is going to play a very, very important role. This is a very powerful country. And the strength of nationalistic feeling is also profoundly important. I would say, for example, the way that Chinese overseas students are used is just as effective as any missile. And that's why we need to get assertive about it. I'm not talking about collective punishment. I'm not talking about, treating them in a hostile way. Just reminding them that they are in someone else's country and that this is China number one nonsense. This aggressive nationalism, this arrogant attitude. I mean, an example of this being the way that the CGTN reporter Kong Lin Lim acted when she was in Birmingham. Rudely heckling the speaker, and then the Chinese embassy had the audacity to demand an apology. I really, really would like to see a situation where we start demanding apologies, where not just the Five Eyes countries, but our friends in France and elsewhere really start to see what China's doing. I certainly don't want a war with China, and I don't want to see China in chaos, believe it or not. I really don't. Because of friends there, I don't want them to be hurt or impacted by that. This is not the sort of thing I would talk to my friends about, though, because the even intelligent people are taken in by this hysterical nationalism where there is no room for introspection. And anytime a Westerner speaks the truth, oh well, they're just a spy, or they're jealous of China's success. Jealous? Do I want to live in a country where I can't freely speak my mind? Absolutely not. And as much as my country is facing great uncertainty right now, I can still speak my mind. I can criticise Boris Johnson. I can talk about murky things the British government has done without reprimand, and that is the fundamental difference. And a final point, even if I say I'm not xenophobic, I'm not anti-China, it makes no difference, because Chinese mainlanders they will hear what they want to hear. I do have great affection for China, the country. I have affection for the Chinese people, their generosity. I have affection for the diversity of China, the beautiful natural landscapes of China, the food of China. And yes, it is an ancient culture. But when the Communist Party This is another thing they do, and the same can be said actually of the regime in Iran. When they use, "Oh, we're an ancient civilization," they're ignoring the fact that it was Mao that helped to destroy much of that in the Cultural Revolution. So just as the Chinese Communist Party cannot claim to own China, the Iranian regime cannot claim to own Iran. You know, they may have absolute power. But I really think interesting things will develop. I think we need to really, really get assertive, and we need to say to Chinese students, look, you're welcome here. You've paid a lot of money. You know, you're here to study. We hope you have a good time. Stay safe. Make friends. Take in the experience. But you're not in China, and you're not here to promote Chinese nationalism. We need to make that crystal clear. And I don't think we've done that. I think we need to really review Confucius Institutes. I think we need to look at everything. We definitely need to strip CGTN of its license. This is a network that's aired forced confessions, and it's an absolute abomination in my view that they're allowed to operate in London. Of course there'll be reprisals against British networks, but that's the situation we're in. As for Hong Kong, we need to stand by the principle of the protests, but I personally think that, you know, those rioting, they're idiots, because all they're doing is giving Beijing what it wants. And, you know, in the end of the day, stopping other Hong Kongers from going about their daily business is just stupid. It's like any movement, you know, it's like Extinction Rebellion. All that sort of stuff does is backfire. It's stupid, and I don't support that. I don't support vandalism. I support anger. I support anger against Carrie Lam and against Beijing's agenda, and I support the principle of the movement, but not vandalism. I think that would just play into Beijing's hands. 10 years from now, you know, the 80th anniversary, will we be seeing something similar? I think a lot depends on Xi Jinping's approach to Hong Kong. It may well be that there is a great gulf between mainlanders and Hong Kongers, and mainlanders will just view them as, you know, ungrateful because, hey, you've got all this wealth, what are you complaining about? Because a lot of mainlanders are very materialistically see things. I had a heated argument with someone I know, and her logic was, well, Hong Kong's got great economic success. What are they complaining about? And they don't seem to comprehend the idea of the principles of democracy, freedom of speech and so on. Why that is just as sacred as, you know, having the means of a comfortable life. So I really do think we need to get assertive. I think it will be interesting to see what happens with Taiwan. In recent weeks, unfortunately, Taiwan's been losing support. A lot of the small Pacific nations, they're in a difficult position. They rely on China. They need Chinese money. So it's kind of economic blackmail. That's what China is doing. They are getting involved in these big trade deals with countries, giving them money to buy their silence, which explains what's happening with the persecution of the Uyghurs, and it is an absolute disgrace that so-called, so much for the Islamic Ummah, you know, when countries like Pakistan are turning a blind eye. It's a disgrace, it's tragic. One thing we can close with though, and this is a truism: no dictatorship in history lasts forever. At some point, I think the CCP are going to really shoot themselves in the foot. They are, at the moment, they have a lot of power. I think that's, I don't agree with those who say it's starting to crumble. I do think they have a lot of power right now. But will this last forever? Will we be seeing a 100th anniversary celebration of the PRC? I don't know. I think that Xi Jinping is relying on overseas nationalism. I think he's relying on an idea of maintaining stability. But at some point that is going to be tested, and not just in Hong Kong, in the mainland as well. And I've no sympathy for him or his party. I don't want to see China in chaos. Believe it or not, I want China to do well, because China in chaos won't be good for the world economy and we'll all be affected. So it's not a case of, oh, I want to see China collapse. I would like to see it knocked down a peg or two, insofar as I'd like to see their arrogance put on guard. I'd like to see their arrogance put to the test, you know. But I don't want to see any bloodshed, and I just think that I think for years now, I'll close with this, free countries have kind of had this idea, if we go along with China, if we have a softly approach to reform of their own accord, well, China has risen economically, and that's been impressive. But the political reforms haven't come, and if anything, it's only got worse. So this idea, oh well, we won't talk about human rights, we'll just turn a blind eye to it as Cameron and Osborne done, and then maybe China will reform of its own accord. It just proves that isn't working. And the Chinese argument, it's the Chinese version of human rights. They pick and choose like it's a menu. Won't wash with those of us who see what's going on here. And it's really, the situation's really sad, but I do not believe this will last forever. That's no comfort to a Uyghur person in one of these concentration camps, but I do think at some point in the next 10 years the Communist Party is going to mess up in a big way, and then they'll have only themselves to blame when they eventually fall from power. And that day, provided there's minimal unrest, will be fantastic as far as I'm concerned. But one day the Chinese people will need to know the truth. One day they'll see that the last 70 years, the victims of the Red Guards and others, they'll see what's been happening. Well, they already know that, but I'm talking about the wider population. And I think the surest sign that China will move forward will be the day that they take down the Mao statues, or at least stop venerating Mao. And time will tell.